Welcome everybody. As you will, I'm sure, be aware, this is the first such gathering since before COVID. In the olden days, we used to gather somewhere generally in the Midlands, and talk for the weekend, often with a practical element as well. So we are trying new technology, and hopefully that will get more people involved and more people learning from past events, etc. As you'll see from the programme, David will be on soon, then Barry, then me, about a third of the time each, but we'll see how it goes. And then quick plug for the 12th and the 19th of February, and I'll talk a bit more about those at the end. So, when we did have the conferences, we traditionally started by going around everybody and asking who you were and where you came from and what events you were involved with. Well, that's quite hard with about 80 of you. So this is a summary of what you put on the registration form. And you can see who has been coordinating and organising things, planning. I hope I've captured your record there somewhere, but some I probably haven't. So you're under etc. in the right-hand column. Hope that's okay. But you will see that there are lots and lots of people, which is fantastic. A range of controller levels, and it's absolutely fine. If you're not a controller, it should be of use to everybody who is involved in not just major events, but any event. Hopefully there are lessons to be learnt. We'll see how we get on. Without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to David, who will talk about the rules. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's great to see so many of you here today. Just to introduction, the aim of the session then is to take you through the documents which the British Orienteering Rules Group has revised, picking out noticeable changes and highlighting aspects which have been around for a while, but which have often been overlooked. My qualifications for taking on this task are already in the webinar details. I volunteered for the Federation in the technical area for the best part of 30 years now, and that experience has been very useful in my current role in the Rules Group. My work for the IOF means that we are closely in touch with those IOF rules and any updates which are relevant to us, and helps us to ensure that our rules are aligned with the IOF rules wherever they are dealing with the same situation. As a controller, I have been frustrated by lack of regular communications regarding training, case studies and rule changes, and hope that the creation of the Rules Group in 2022 will improve this. The recent mail to all controllers highlighting the new rules, as well as this seminar, are a part of this. I want to begin with a pertinent quote. One of the main changes has been reordering of information into more sensible groups, and thus the number of rules is different. Other than that, the aim has been to rationalise what already existed, bring the rules up to date, and clarify areas where problems have been experienced in the past. You might think that this quote comes from today's updated rules, but in fact comes from 1997 and was written by another seminar presenter, Simon Errington, as the foreword to that year's rules update. A copy of those 1997 rules is shown, and the association representatives of the then Rules Group ran sessions to explain the update. For example, in June 1996, I remember addressing a joint South East South Central Controllers Conference to give a session on the changes of the 1997 rules. For interest, a copy of the 2003 rules is also shown, and there's quite a contrast between the two. 145 pages in the first and 21 pages in the second. The reason for the difference is that the 1997 document had 11 rules, 4 appendices and 19 guidelines, whereas in 2003 there were 9 rules only. The appendices and 12 event guidelines were published separately. By contrast, the 2024 edition has 28 rules and 5 appendices in its 103 pages, and 22 competition rules, roughly equivalent to the old guidelines, are published individually and separately. At face value, we have over 3 times as many rules in 2024 as we had in 2003, and this looks like rampant rules inflation. But if you look in closer detail, we find only 50% more pages and a bigger font used in 2024 as well. So on this very crude measure, maybe the difference isn't that great after all. The main difference is that the rules are packaged very differently nowadays, so it's hard to compare over a 21-year span. Yes, some new rules have had to be added to reflect the evolving of our sport, but at the same time, many of the 2003 rules have subsequently been divided into more compact packages, and their number has increased as a result. So, on to the 2024 Rules and Appendices. And the first thing to note is that for the first time, we've followed the lead of the IOF and referred to foot orienteering. This is in order to distinguish these from the rules of other disciplines such as Trello. The heading shown is taken from the introductory cover sheet of the new rules, which lower down continues by describing the 6 principles which govern the update. It's worth dwelling for a moment or two on what these are. The first of these is to be in line with IOF rules, in particular, to equalize men's and women's winning times for all age classes. A couple of years ago, the IOF did a lot of work on gender equality within orienteering and proposed that men and women should have equal winning times, initially for major elite events such as WOC and the World Cup. They subsequently extended this to world ranking events and the Junior World and World Masters Championships too. These proposals were subsequently agreed by IOF Council. In particular, all world ranking events should have the same winning time for long distance races as for WOC. That's 88 to 92 minutes for both M21E and W21E. This has a knock-on effect at our domestic level A events, many of which have world ranking status, so need equal 21E winning times as a result. Our leading athletes need to be able to prepare for world ranking events, so we need to equalize M21E and W21E winning times at all other level A long distance races too. The IOF also equalized men's and women's winning times at the World Masters, starting from this year. As for the elite classes, exactly as for elite classes, women's winning times are increased to be the same as the existing men's winning times. This raised the question of whether or not British Orienteering should adopt a similar policy. So, in August last year, a survey was conducted of British Orienteering members on gender equality and winning times. A majority was in favour of equalising winning times and with winning times being increased to be the same as men's, and across the board too. It's important to appreciate that since sprint and middle distance races have equal winning times for men and women already, this policy only affects long distance events. As a result, all relevant tables of courses have been updated, so that many women's courses now have a greater length than before. It also means that many women's classes are combined with a higher group of classes than before. There's also an effect on the standard combinations of classes on colour-coded courses, again with some women's classes now promoted to a higher colour. Of course, they're still free to enter whichever course they want, as ever. A common complaint about the previous rules was that some rules appeared identically in different places. Sometimes even whole chunks of text were duplicated. This was obviously confusing, and so we made a big effort to remove any duplications we could find. They're actually harder to identify than you might think, so whilst we think we've removed them all, it's possible that some still lurk there. If so, please let us know. We also wanted to reduce duplication between our rules and those contained in IOF specifications. For example, the Planning Appendix B used to specify line thicknesses and colours for drawing. But as these are also specified in the current versions of the IOF mapping specifications, ISOM and ISPROM, and since our rules say course markings must be in accord with ISOM and ISPROM, there's no need to repeat this detail in our rules. For those not familiar with these IOF documents, ISOM and ISPROM are the specifications to be followed when drawing maps for forest and sprint events. The SPR in ISPROM stands for sprint. The screenshots shown are the covers of the current versions of each one, and show that both have undergone minor revisions since their launches in 2017 and 2019, respectively. Our own rules and appendices are careful to refer only to the current versions of each one to avoid, without mentioning the date, to avoid going out of alignment when an update occurs. We found quite a few places where individual rules or groups of rules would be better moved elsewhere, where the context was more appropriate. One example of this was in the old Appendix A, the Event Systems Appendix, where special conditions regarding provisions for elite classes were itemized separately for each individual major event. The relevant section in this appendix then took up over 2 pages of space. So it made sense for the special conditions for the elite at BOC to go into the BOC competition rule, those for the JK to go into the JK competition rule, and so on. We tried to reduce ambiguities as much as possible too. For example, the text, "Courses are planned in a safe manner," could refer to avoidance of repetitive strain injury, whereas "courses are planned so they may be completed in a safe manner" puts the emphasis on safety from the competition point of view. Also, the previous edition of the rules followed the IOF lead by replacing the obsolete shall with must, but a few legacy instances remained, and these have been removed. And references to external documents, links, etc., have been checked and updated where necessary, again with the example being links to IOF documents. Previously, each appendix was prefaced by the statement that this appendix is to be read in conjunction with the British Orienteering Rules of Orienteering. Clearly, the appendices had some sort of connection with the rules, but how far did this connection go? Were the clauses within the appendices also rules, or were they guidelines? It wasn't clear. What was clear, however, was that, for example, where Appendix A deals with, let's say, start times for seeded competitors at Level A events, and states competitors identified are to be kept at least the minimum separation time apart in the start list, this was intended to be mandatory and not optional. Rules Group then identified many other instances of mandatory content spread across the 5 appendices and decided to indicate these by formatting them in bold text. So the use of emboldening indicates a rule. Conversely, normal text is for information or guidance and is not mandatory. The 2024 appendices are now introduced as previously, but with the added sentence, emboldened text signifies that the content is mandatory, i.e. has the same status as the main rules. Despite their name, the main rules also contain a mixture of mandatory and non-mandatory clauses. But we decided not to extend the emboldening principle to these as well, because the document is entitled Rules, so you'd expect the content to include rules, and also use of the word must signifies what is mandatory already. I think that at this stage it's worth explaining how we got this far. The genesis of the current rules group is a bit woolly, but I do know that I became a member of the newly formed Rules Working Group in June of 2022. Some 18 months or so ago now. This then became a subgroup of the Events and Competitions Committee in late 2022, when it was labelled Rules Group. Its current membership is 8, 4 of whom have previous experience as members of the old Rules Group, which ceased existence in 2008. 9 responsibilities for the group are listed on the British Orienteering website, with perhaps the most important appearing at the top: formulating, writing, reviewing, and publishing the rules of orienteering for British Orienteering. Our plan was to take the whole document and divide it into 4 coherent parts, each containing both rules and appendices. Each chunk was then reviewed by 2 rules group members, with the aim of identifying duplications, errors, etc., agreeing what these were, and then reporting back to the group. These 4 chunks were then recombined, and the whole group then had a second go at identifying issues. This generated a first draft of the 2024 rules and appendices, which went out to consultation to all British Orienteering members last November, with a mid-December deadline for responses. We had a very useful set of responses, and as a result, and these were then incorporated into the final draft. There's a little known feature of Microsoft Word which counts revisions, and it reckoned that there are over 1,600 of them in our 100+ page document. I don't know how a revision is defined, but I do know, as the one doing much of the editing, that we've been pretty thorough in our work. After one last review by the group, it was polished and formatted and sent for publication just before our end of the 2023 deadline. It's important to add that, with time for such a big project not being on our side, our intention was always to go for the quick win updates for 2024, leaving to one side perhaps more controversial issues to be reviewed during the course of this year, with a November target this year of doing so. During the rest of the session, I want to identify what the significant changes are, and whilst doing so, highlight existing rules which are often not known about or are misunderstood. One oddity which we need to sort out straight away was the fact that the 2023 rules had 2 chapters with the same title, both event officials. The old 12 had nothing to do with officials at all and was all about rule applicability, whereas the old 15 was appropriately labelled as it dealt with the responsibilities of event officials. It did what it said on the tin. This was solved simply by relabelling the old chapters. So the old 12 now became Rule 3 and is about rule applicability, whereas the old 15 now becomes Rule 12 and is a chapter about the responsibilities of event officials. Following some near misses with regard to heat exhaustion in recent times, we had no difficulty in adopting the proposal from Elite Orienteers about the provision of drinks controls on the longest courses, and we introduced a new rule into the course planning chapter. As on screen, if a course has an estimated winning time of more than 75 minutes, then there must be at least 1 drinks point around the course. This is irrespective of weather conditions, which can't be predicted at the time when courses are planned anyway. In practice, it applies only to the M21E and W21E courses at the British Championships, Long Championships, JK Long and Area Championships, where the estimated winning time is 90 minutes. The black course at a colour-coded event should be planned to an elite winning time of 67 minutes, so Rule 18.6 won't apply. This does not mean that drinks points aren't necessary for black courses, however, as unusually hot conditions may mean that safety considerations come into play and that drinks are needed. There's been an IOF rule about drinks for many decades now, and it's much more conservative than our new one. This, of course, takes precedence if we are staging a world ranking event at home. An example of duplication is provided by old rules 1815 and 1816, which dealt with printing methods for level A and level B maps, and where much the same text appeared in the old mapping appendix, Appendix D. These have now been removed from Chapter 18 in the rules and now appear in the mapping appendix, a much more logical place to find them. This also has the important benefit of not having the same information in 2 different places. Changing tack somewhat, I want to consider a leg from the M45A course at the World Masters 2019 long final in Latvia. The leg is from 7 to 8, where a large lake is crossed by the line. All sorts of routes are possible. There's one right of the lake. There's one left of the lake. It's longer, but there's more track run and there's a drinks point, so it's a possible option. And there's the shortest way, which involves swimming the lake at its narrowest point. One runner took this, and his split time for the leg was 2 minutes faster than anyone else's. It's now time for a bit of interactivity, and I want you to complete the questions in the poll, which should be visible on the screen shortly. The questions are: is the runner disqualified under IOF rules, or is he okay as he's not broken an IOF rule? And also, if this took place under British rules, is the runner, same thing, disqualified or okay? I now hand over to Joe in the hope that we can get this poll running.
So the first poll has ended, and you have 90% of people saying the runner is okay as he has not broken an IOF rule.
So 10% say he's disqualified, okay?
Yeah. And I will now close the second poll. Ooh, a bit more of a split room on this one. 43% say that this person is disqualified, and 57% say that he's not broken a rule.
Okay, so yeah,
There you go.
interesting, very interesting indeed. Okay,
Thank you.
let's carry on then. Am I back in control?
You're in charge.
Right, well, the answer is that and that. And obviously 90% were right in the first one and 57% were right in the second one. And I think I better go and say a little bit more about this and why that's the case. It's a lot of it's to do with the word uncrossable. The word uncrossable appears 23 times in ISOM and 43 times in ISPROM. And it means different things in the two specifications. So we have to come to terms with this, especially as it means, as I say, different things with different types of map. It's not what we were brought up to believe, but on a forest ISOM map, the so-called uncrossable symbols, double tag fences, black lines around marshes, etc., only mean that the feature is very hard or maybe dangerous to cross, i.e. definitely not recommended, but you can do it at your own peril, at your own risk. This is clarified by IOF Rule 17.2, which details which features cannot be crossed, and there aren't many. That's IOF 17.2, and it starts off by saying competitors must not cross features drawn with the following symbols. I just want to focus on features for this particular session part of the slide. That's what happens there. As far as forest events are concerned, as far as ISOM is concerned, there are only 4, and they're all out of bounds type places, olive green color or purple cross hatching. There's no fences, no lakes, etc. specified there in the forest. For sprint, we get a completely different list here. The ones for the forest are there included, but there's a whole lot of extra ones come on board. Uncrossable cliff, uncrossable body of water, etc. So note that symbol 301 there, uncrossable body of water, must not be crossed if mapped for a sprint event, but there's no such restriction in the forest. So the lake in the Latvian example can be crossed in a forest race, but cannot be crossed in a sprint event. Now, those people who thought things were different from the British rules, that's incorrect, because we refer in our BOF rules to the IOF in terms of mapping specifications. And mapping specification 301, uncrossable body of water, has exactly the same meaning for an IOF event as it does in a British event, because we refer back to ISOM and ISPROM. So unfortunately, we have a situation where the IOF Map Commission publishes the forest and sprint specifications and updates them only at random intervals. So the proliferation of the word uncrossable meaning different things remains. We are where we are. So in order to minimize potential confusion in our rules, we have used the term forbidden to cross in every instance where this is what's intended. For example, in Rule 17.4, where the use of uncrossable has now been replaced by forbidden to cross. And we've added a new Rule 26.4 to clarify and confirm this. Boundaries described as uncrossable or impassable symbols on an ISPROM map must not be crossed. Similar boundaries shown on an ISOM map should not be crossed. Should not, so it's a difference between must and should. So that's been the case all along, but it's been a little known fact. It was only this example in Latvia which brought it to a head. Moving on to the appendices, I previously mentioned the whole chunk of special conditions regarding how elite start draws, etc., should be managed, have been moved to the appropriate competition rule. I should add that reference to this move has been left behind in Appendix A, where it used to be, so that those looking for this information are now pointed to where it can be found. Moving on to planning appendix, there's quite a lot to cover here, especially with respect to the tables, which give course parameters for different distances. 2 things have driven the updates needed. The first being that men's and women's running times are now equalized for the same age, meaning that many women's courses are longer at long distance events. The second is that long distance table, in particular, dates back a few decades, during which time running speeds have changed, particularly for the oldest classes, and this affects course lengths too. Table 8.6 is arguably the most important tool which planners and controllers use in order to produce courses for the majority of our events. It sets the parameters needed to design the required suite of courses for each event, and also suggests to competitors which course their class suits best. The new criterion that men's and women's winning times needed to be equalized was tricky to apply. How do you equalize winning times when you don't know what they are? Because no winning times appear on the table. The only time which is known is that the black course should have an expected elite winning time of 67 minutes. Assuming this to be the M21 winning time, then it follows that the W21 winning time should be 67 minutes too. But what about the rest? Fortunately, it turned out the table in last year's appendix had evolved from a similar table for badge courses published in the 1995 rules. Since the 1995 table contained course length ratio and running speed data, it was possible to reverse engineer from these to establish what the winning times would be for each age class in 2024, and then match all women's times to the equivalent men's time. An outline of the stages needed appears on this slide for those interested, but time prevents going into all the detail at this stage. One example of the gender equality application is that W55 now has a longer course than before and is matched to short blue rather than green, as W55L. Other women find that their theoretical increase in course length is not big enough to move them to a longer course, and they therefore remain on the same course. As mentioned earlier, some running speeds are higher now than they used to be 30 years ago. One example is that of M70, a class which is now matched to short blue, moving up from green. There are other examples too, but many remain unchanged as well. Table 9.6 for middle distance events is much less affected, as men's and women's winning times are the same anyway. Any minor movements are caused by speed ratio updates and mean that, for example, M80 and M85 are better suited by very short green than short green, as they were actually overplaced before. Table 10.6 for sprint distance events is also little affected. The only change has been caused by running speed updates, the M16 change on the screen there being one example. As far as sprint is concerned, the main difference is that the height correction formula has now been revised in that the allowance for height climb is now half that for forest events. The reason for the difference is that course lengths on sprint and urban maps are optimal distances, whereas they are more or less straight line distances on forest maps. The other difference for sprint is that the range of course lengths needed for each course now refers to optimal lengths, i.e. around all buildings and other impassable objects. Sprint course lengths have always had to be measured as optimal lengths, but this wasn't reflected in previous versions of this table, hence the amendment. Moving on to the urban distance table, apart from the clarification that the range of course lengths refers to optimal lengths, the table is identical to that in last year's appendix. An extract is shown on the slide. Unlike, for example, sprint and middle distance events, urban races do not form any part of the IOF programme, so there are no standards set internationally to follow. Different organisers have different ideas about what constitutes an urban race, and whilst the UK Urban League refers to table 11.6, we are not yet sure that the standard was used elsewhere. This is another topic we will revisit during the year, after which I suspect that the table will look a little different. This part of the rules definitely represents work in progress. Moving on to Appendix C about event officials, this is mostly as before, with a few outdated items being amended. For example, there was a reference to a register of licensed officials in the previous version. We didn't think that this existed nowadays, so 1.1.5 has been deleted. Mapping appendix. There have been a few amendments to this. One significant change relates to table 2.2, which gives map scales permitted for each type of event at level A or B, and how scales vary with age class 2. For example, the normal scale for over 65s in a middle race is 1 to 7.5, but depending on circumstances, 1 to 10 and 1 to 5 are permitted alternatives too. The table is unchanged from before, with the exception of map scales permitted for level A or level B urban races. Previously, the normal scale was 1 to 5, with a 1 to 4 alternative, but this has been modified to a normal scale of 1 to 4, with alternatives of 1 to 5 and 1 to 3. Note that footnote 2 says to ensure legibility, a 1 to 5 urban maps need to be drawn at that scale with 100% symbols and not just reduced from a map drawn at 1 to 4. The reason I mention that is that when I'm preparing these slides, I noticed that the footnote just mentioned conflicted with a reference to the same information contained within table 2.5.3, which gives additional information about map standards for different events. Quite clearly, the symbol size for 133% for urban maps at a 1 to 5 scale is nonsense. If anything, it should be smaller than 100% to match a smaller scale. But our policy is to keep the same size symbols for the two scales, so its value should be 100%. This example highlights the fact that despite a large amount of scrutiny from a wide variety of people, mistakes can still creep in. Rules Group hopes that if any further errors are spotted, we can be informed about them so that future editions can include the corrections. The previous appendix contained quite a few tables, many of which duplicated information in other tables. The one on screen is table 2.5 from the 2023 appendices, which related to level A maps. Much of the detail is also in the table we've just been looking at on the last slide, whilst other information appears later on in an updated section 3, which deals in map printing. There's no need for this table anymore, so it's been deleted. The last appendix, E, on event safety, has had no significant changes, although the last section, number 8, entitled Important Contact Details, has been updated. Underneath the link to the main rules and appendices on the BOF rules page appears a list of some 23 separate competition rules. The screenshot shows the first 14 in this list. Rules Group has also brought up to date all but 3 of the list, the exceptions being the Harvester, the Yvette Baker Trophy, and the ranking scheme. So we've been busy. We wanted to give organisers of major events in the first part of 2024 early notice of what the changes were. However, our task of updating the 100+ pages of the rules and appendices, plus some 20 different competition rules, meant that this notice occurred in early to mid-December, rather later than we would have liked. And this gave extra pressure to some organisers. We have apologised for this, especially as there were effects on course planning. Since the major changes to the competition rules are similar for many of them, I'll just look at one example, that of competition rule A, the British Long Distance Championships. Apart from formatting changes, which involve removal of boxes around text and sections in italics, the major change was driven by the male-female equal winning time policy and its effect on course lengths. The screenshot of the 2024 courses table looks similar to previous editions, the exceptions being, firstly, that we have replaced ranges of winning times by a single value at the midpoint of the range. So the 70-minute winning time for M35L on course 5 replaces the previous 65 to 75-minute range of last year. The reason for this was that the ranges were too wide, especially for the shorter courses. For example, M14A used to have a winning time range of 35 to 45 minutes, with the high end being nearly 30% longer than the short end. The corollary of this is that two courses could differ in length by nearly 30% and still fit the bill for M14A. We are left, however, with the anomaly that ranges of winning times are published for sprint and middle races, but not for long. But something similar happens in the IOF rules too, so we're not alone. The main difference relates to equalisation of winning times. Thus, M21E on course 1 has the same winning time of 90 minutes as does W21E on course 2. Another example is that M45L on course 6 has the same winning time of 65 minutes as does W45L on course 10. This represents an increase of 5 minutes for W45L. However, many winning times for older classes were the same last year anyway, so much of the table looks the same as before. Each competition rule table is described as giving suggested course class combinations, and that for the BOC long distance event we've just looked at assumes an entry of 1,500 competitors. If the entry is significantly different from this, then the number of courses may need to be increased or decreased accordingly, and this means a certain amount of movement of classes onto different courses. In order to help the planners, ensure that a class is moved on to a course of suitable length, new tables showing the target course length ratio for each class have been added. The one for the British Long Championship is being shown on the slide. Obviously, there are many more changes than the ones mentioned so far, but I think I've covered the main ones in this session. One key message is that we should all throw away our 2023 documentation and refer only to the 2024 updates. We started off by planning to indicate every change in the new documents, but it became clear that it was just not practical to do so. So the cover sheet of the rules and appendices highlights the 6 main categories of change instead, the ones I began with this presentation with. So thank you for bearing with me. Now time for some questions. Over to you, Joe.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David, for that presentation. Really interesting to get into the details of all the updates, although admittedly, some of it's definitely a bit over my head still, but still very enjoyable regardless.
Yeah, sorry to say quick, but there was a lot. I hope people can follow it. If not, they have to look at the video next tomorrow.
Well, the good news is, yeah, that they do have that video available coming out tomorrow. I've got a couple of questions, and then we'll probably look to maybe field 1 or 2 and then move on to Barry's section with potential to revisit everything at the end, if that sounds good. So the first I can see, for anybody who wants to put a question into the chat or Q&A, they can, or they can raise their hand. The first one is from Martin. It says, it's asking why BOF have written a rule that says should not be crossed for things like ISOM, uncrossable fences, when the map specification allows it to be crossed. Doesn't that just introduce potential confusion?
I was hoping that what we've done is got rid of that confusion. So, for example, a 2-tag fence on a forest map simply means that you ought not to cross it, but you can do if you feel it's possible, or it may be too dangerous to cross. But it is allowable, and exactly the same as the situation with the lake in the example I gave. You are allowed to cross, swim a lake, even though it's got a so-called uncrossable line around it. The same one on a sprint map, no, you can't do it. The difference, I think, is because in a forest race, the map presents an area where you can run wherever you want to, basically. And if it's dangerous to cross something, it just shows you on the symbols. In a sprint race, you can't do that because you've got to confine the courses to certain corridors. So if you don't want people to cross a fence because it affects the way in which the courses are planned, then you can't do it. You must put 2 tags on to make sure that they are definitely must not be crossed. I don't know if that answers the question.
My problem, David, thanks for that answer, but I think you said you'd written a new rule in the British Orienteering rules that said uncrossable fences should not be crossed, rather than shall not be crossed. But that relies on people knowing what should and shall each mean, whereas what you've just said is uncrossable fences may be crossed. If you want to have a go, you're welcome to. You won't be disqualified. So saying should not be crossed, I feel, just makes it a bit confusing.
I'm assuming that people know the difference between should and must in doing that.
I think we on the call do, but competitors may not. That's my concern, I guess.
No,
all
fair
right,
point.
Thanks.
If as a next question, Ian's just popped in the chat, and if there are some parts that I end up saying wrong, that's part capitalized, part not, that's hopefully somebody can correct me, possibly Alan. Ian's asked mapping query. BOF has some changes to ISS Prom 2019 too. When should IOF spec be followed? International WRE JK, but not otherwise.
No, well, in theory, for every event, but of course you have a situation where for many club events the map was drawn 4 years ago, 5 years ago to a standard which existed then, and nobody's going to complain about it. I think the necessity increases the higher the level of the event we're talking about.
And I'll go for
Can I just rephrase that last question from Ian? Why does BOP have changes to the mapping spec? I know one of them was to do with trees with a white dot in it. They were put forward to the IOF. I was at the meeting and they refused it. So why do we still have a difference?
Don't know.
This is the official BOP rules for, or maybe guidelines. I can't remember where they are in it.
I think you need to ask. Well, you sound as if you are a mapping guru.
No, I was at the other side of the fence.
The answer to that's above my pay grade, I'm afraid.
Can I suggest we note it and take it away and try and come back maybe for next week?
It's not just it's Ian Cooper here. It's not just a mapping query. One of the changes is the overprint specification for line thicknesses. BOF have changed it to 0.45 as opposed to IF's 0.35. So we should know what events we have to use the BOF spec and what events we have to use the IF spec. And my interpretation is that if it's a world ranking event or JK, then we should stick to IF spec. But if it's below that, we should probably use the BOF spec. But I don't know why there's a difference. I don't know why there's a difference.
The rule says you use the IOF spec, and it doesn't actually specify. It deliberately doesn't specify line thickness whereas it used to do, simply so that we're always in step with the IOF. But
then the mapping committee need to amend their specification that's on the BOF website that's got differences to IOF.
Well, what we've been dealing with are the rules and appendices, and the mapping appendix does not include that. So whatever else the map is on the BOF website, I don't know about, because that's not. I'm assuming that people looking at wanting to find out what the map specs are will look at the mapping appendix, and not anywhere else.
Brian has just clarified it's because international colourblind competitors find it clearer than British colourblind competitors.
I was about to jump. Oh, sorry, Brian.
Again, I think this is a question which is taken outside of our remit.
Thank you. Do you have anything else on that one, Brian? I've seen you waiting with your hand up.
No, it's an important point for about 10% of men. But as David says, it's a mapping issue, not specifically a British rules issue. Thank you for taking the time for me to react.
In which case, I can see Barry. Are you ready to go?
I hope so. Assuming the technology works for me. So let me introduce myself. My name is Barry Elkington, and I'm from the Octavian Drubers Orienteering Club. And my challenge for the next 15 to 20 minutes is to get you enthusiastic and excited about this booklet, and also, I hope, learn something. So if we look at a brief history of the IOF control descriptions, sometime in 1979, the original control descriptions appeared from the IOF. And at some point, probably 1987 from the rules I have, these began to appear as Appendix A in the BOF rules. Over the years, the fundamentals haven't really changed. And given a set of control descriptions from back then, from 1979 or 1990, you would still be able to understand them. At some point, I must have said or written something about the control descriptions, as around the turn of the century, I was asked to review and edit the 2004 version, and have since been the editor for the last 2 updates. If we can start with a quick summary of how the control descriptions work. The primary thing is that a good control is found by reading the map, not by deciphering the control descriptions. This is something that's particularly important in sprint races. Keep the control description short and simple if you can. So for example, unless it's a very wide path, as a competitor, I really don't need to know which side it's on. And if the map is wrong, don't use the control description to correct it. You can't use control.
Sorry to interrupt you quickly. Should we be seeing slides yet, as a question?
Yeah, sorry, have you not seen the slides?
No, we haven't. But I didn't want to interrupt your flow so much. I was enjoying it.
Right. So that's my introduction slide. That's the booklet that I'd like everybody to get really enthusiastic about and hopefully learn something from. a brief history of the control descriptions. If anybody actually has a copy of the original 1979 IOF descriptions that they'd like to scan and send me a copy of, that would be much appreciated, because it's something that's missing from my my history. But as I said, they haven't really changed very much over the years, and anybody presented with control descriptions from back then would still be able to understand them. So these were the key points as to how the descriptions work. As I said, it's about reading the map, not about convoluted control descriptions or having to read the control descriptions to work out where the flag's hidden. Ideally, you should be able to figure that out from the map, and the control descriptions are just an assist to confirm that your interpretation of the map is correct if you need it. So keep the descriptions as short and simple as possible, and do not use them to correct map errors. If the map is wrong, then you simply can't use that control site. And I think that's probably something everybody planning a course should know. So if we actually move on to the updates that were made for 2024, when I submitted the change deck to the IOF, there were in fact 68 items on it. However, the vast majority were updating references to ISOM and ISS prom and clarifying the language to make the English more understandable for those needing to translate the booklet into a foreign language. Only the 8 changes here are likely to be relevant to planners or competitors. So the first thing is that all these descriptions now apply to both ISOM and ISS prom. So it's been merged into one booklet and having a single combined set of descriptions. Initially, based on clarity of reading, the booklet stated that all control description sheets would be printed in black. However, it was pointed out that if you have litho-printed maps and need to overprint, for example, relay courses, you actually want to print the course and the control descriptions at the same time. So in those circumstances, overprinting of the description sheet in purple is acceptable. The third point is that the clarification symbol in column C, which is the arrow pointing north, south, east, west, etc. If it's not sufficient to unambiguously define the placement of the control flag, then the feature is not suitable for a control site. This has been a known problem for some years. So, for example, you cannot have the northeast bend of a southern stream because you do not have 2 arrows to use. So in those circumstances, either think of a better way to define the control site or don't use it. We have a couple of new symbols. We have the COPS, or rather a definition of the symbol, which is that in some forests we see small patches, typically of silver birch, where they are in much more runnable areas of trees. Sorry, they're a runnable area of trees surrounded by thicker forest. And the example there is from Sutton Park. And the original COPS symbol was only to be used for trees in open land. It can now be used for a very runnable tree area in thicker forest. The use of the building symbol has been extended to include a pillar supporting a roof. So, for example, underground car parks, multi-level buildings. A new symbol has been added for a railway or tramway. Somebody wanted to know why on earth would you put a control on a railway? But in fact, there are a number of particularly old army sites where there are disused railway tracks still embedded in the ground, and you may want to use those for a control feature.
Barry, if you don't mind me quickly interjecting, I can see Simon's got his hand up.
Yeah,
are you happy for him to
take a question now? Yes.
Yeah, but just because it's come up very recently on the JK that we're dealing with, point 5 relating to the use of building for pillars.
Yes.
The clarification that people need to be aware of is that's where the pillar is actually mapped on the map. So it's a black square pillar symbol.
Yes. Yes.
We had a question that our planner was saying, should I use it for the corner of the canopy, even though the pillar's not mapped? It's just a thin metal post. He was saying it, but that's the pillar supporting the roof, so I should call it a building. So that's only for use where the map itself shows the pillar as a mapped item, and therefore it's quite a big pillar. It's
and that's
not for
actually
just
that's included in the if you read the booklet, it makes it clear that that is the case.
Okay.
Yes.
Brilliant.
So it
Thanks,
actually is the black building block that you see, but it means you can actually use that even though it's just probably a column of concrete rather than a building in itself.
But you're still going to see canopy corners, for example, where it's just hanging on a very narrow metal post or something that's supporting the canopy. Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's
it wasn't much a question. You seem to know the answer to it. So yes, that can be used.
Thanks both.
Right. So yeah, the new railway symbol, probably not for live railway running, but for certainly old industrial areas, army bases, etc., where there are old tracks still in the ground, they can now be used, and there's a symbol for them. Specifically, really for sprinting, we can now use the top and beneath symbols to include the representation of the upper or lower of 2 levels. So if you want to put if you want to indicate in the control description that the control is at the lower of 2 levels on the map, you can now do so. And finally, number 8, which was something we were pushing from the UK, which was to have a symbol for turn the map over. Up until then, you'd had to use something like follow tape 0 meters to map exchange, which really isn't a sensible thing. Whereas actually the picture, the little symbol on the right, which shows you what a map flip looks like, turn the map over, I think signifies what must be done. And it also means that in the planning software, the control description software such as Condes or OCAD, you can actually have an English description for that, which also says turn the map over. So hopefully not really major changes that will cause confusion to anybody. So the next bit was your exercise to do before the webinar. And hopefully everybody has seen these set of control descriptions. So this is where we move to the education bit. If all goes to plan, then Joe will now be able to put up a poll in the chat window, and I'd like you all to answer the question: how many errors or problems can you find in that set of control descriptions? Is it 0, 1 to 3, 4 to 6, or 7 or more? Yeah, the favourite is 7 or more, closely followed by 4 to 6. I'm pleased to see that nobody thinks there are no mistakes, although a small number can only find 1 to 3. So if we go back to the presentation, here's the answers. There are 7 definite errors and 1 possible one. And they basically fall into sort of common sets of mistakes. Firstly, the climb and the description for the start triangle are both missing, and you should have both of these. We've got a couple of examples, controls 2 and 6, where you should have features in both the 4th and the 5th column. So 2 paths for the path junction and 2 thickets for between the thickets. We've got 2 cases where ideally we need the height specifying, both for the crag and the boulder. And the control description booklet notes that the dimensions of the features must be given when they add clarity to the map in order to allow the competitor to better visualize the control site. If you've ever run across an open piece of moorland, your technique will be very different if you're looking for a 1 meter high crag than if you're looking for a 5 meter high crag. So it's quite important to know what it is you're looking for. The final one, which is the almost like a recommendation rather than a rule, is that control number 68 and control number 89 could be confused. Now the specifications require you to underline control numbers that are easily confused if viewed upside down. But with the very small area available on the top of an SI box, it's sometimes not possible to do that very clearly. So ideally don't use them, but in fact it isn't against the rules. So yes, anybody that puts 7 or more got the answers right. and those that didn't, I hope, have learnt something. So what I want to move on next is things the controller should check with relation to the control descriptions. Most of these we've actually covered already. Get the description for the start triangle in, get the descriptions in the right column. And we've seen examples where, for some reason, the descriptions have actually been put into the wrong column. Make sure the control is on the feature that is actually stated in the descriptions. Particularly important on sprint maps, where we often find that, well, not often, but do find that people will put the control on the lamppost, and actually the control description will be something completely different, especially where you're trying to gripple controls. Avoid the unnecessarily over complex descriptions. Make sure you put the dimensions of the features where they're needed. Question that was asked, I think, by Alan Rosen before I put this presentation together: does a solitary tree or a small boulder need a side or not? And my response as well: can you see the control from all sides? If you can, you probably don't need to know which side it's on. If you can't, then you do. And finally, the old BOF rules used to require a course closing time to be on the control descriptions. General practice now seems to put both the course closing time and the emergency phone number elsewhere on the map. And if that's the case, you obviously don't need them on the descriptions. And my final little exercise was, what did you think are these suitable control descriptions for a whole set of features where the tarmac symbol or the ground symbol had been used to do the control description? And this was submitted by people who thought that actually, as the control was placed on the tarmac, that was the right description to use.
Barry, could I possibly interrupt your flow once again?
Yep.
We had a few questions just on the last slide. I think as we're into it, I'll quickly go. I can see that we have Richard with a hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself, Richard?
I just want to clarify your point about controls on features not on the map. So particularly, I'm thinking about lampposts. I planned an event last year where all my controls were on lampposts, but I used the description as per, so they're normally on paths or roads or whatever. So I'm just asking, really, I want that point clarifying, because lampposts are obviously a sensible place to gripple controls. And I don't quite understand why it's a problem as long as the control description accurately matches where it is.
You can't have a control description of a feature that doesn't exist. And as far as the map's concerned, that feature doesn't exist.
Yeah, but if you put if the lamppost is on a path within a complex area,
then use the control description path and gripple it to the lamppost. It's on the path, so that's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry, that's what I do, and I just wanted that clarifying, so there's no problem with the use of the lamppost. That's what I didn't understand. Sorry.
No, but we've seen examples where the control description has been a feature, say a tree, and we've actually, or not a tree, but something you can't gripple the control to. So that's been the control description, when in fact the control has been grippled to a fence 10 yards further on as being the nearest place. So it's as much of a planning as a control description problem.
Yeah. That
you need to make the control description match where you're putting the control.
Yes, I agree. I'm in agreement with you on that.
Fine. Were there other questions as well at this point, Joe?
Yep, just a quick one from Peter. I'm not exactly sure which section it was on. He asked whether you want a side or part for the cops, depending on size.
If it's going to be if it's on the border, then you use the edge. If it's on one part area of it, you can use northwest part or southwest part. If it's just a small copse, which the one in Sutton Park was, it was just placed in the middle. So you didn't need any further description at all.
I'll I'll offer the last one from Henry. I can see another hand was up as well, but I'm just conscious of the time that we're getting on as well. So Henry asked for a written description, e.g. white. Would you put path junction?
No, I wouldn't. I just put path junction. The text descriptions are meant to make it easy for young people to understand. So having path junction is probably not so sensible. I've edited when I've done the schools championships. We make the descriptions a bit more like what the child sees rather than necessarily a strict one-for-one translation from the IOF symbols.
John, I can see a hand raised. It might have to be a quick one if that's okay.
There's only
Yeah,
one more slide
just
after
a-
this. So we're
Just
all
a clarification on the copses. Copses are a fair few trees, and if you're not careful and you want to gripple it, you're going to gripple it to a chunk of a big chunky tree. So then you better say north part or something, or preferably not have it gripple to a tree in a copse. So that's when you worry about what edge of a tree it is, or edge of copse would be better in that sense. North edge, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see it heading from the south.
You use the description to decide to explain where in the copse it is if that's needed. If the copse is big, if it's not very big, you probably don't. But,
It's just a warning that if you approach it from the wrong direction and there are several copses in the general area, you approaching it from the south and it's north edge, then you wouldn't expect to see the kite because the trees are big. But if you're approaching from the north, you can. So it's important route choice problem.
Okay.
If the same goes on to your same point as before about thin things, you don't need to say which side.
yeah.
If it's a single tree, you should say which side of it is a big tree. If it's a copse of big trees, it's the same.
Okay. Right. I'll move on to the last slide in the interest of time. David May actually wrote this for the IOF manual, that what you should do is think about what the competitor is navigating to. And whilst the control might be placed on the tarmac in the corner, what the competitor is navigating to is actually the feature that's above the ground. So just remember that. And the tarmac's only really used as a description when it's, say, a step between one level of tarmac and the next, not when the surrounding features go above the ground. So I don't know if we've had all the questions, but if so, thank you for listening. And I hope you have learnt something.
Thank you very much, Barry. How about me?
How about you?
Has my screen appeared?
Screen's
Yes.
appeared well.
Right, I'm going to talk about major events over the last roughly 3 years. For clarity, major event includes JK's, British Champs and the Compass Sport Cup final. And my data has come from surveying the controllers and IOF event advisors. I haven't asked organisers and planners, so this is a slightly biased view, but it is better than nothing, which is what we've had for many, many years. So hopefully we can learn some lessons from the last 3 years, and then maybe during these webinars work out a better way of capturing what went well, what's even better if. So I asked those people what went well. And one thing that we do need to remember, I think, above all, is that we had each year some very successful events. And I've got a very short list of some things that the controllers and event advisors said contributed to that. And then I've got about 6 pages or something of even better if. And it's just the nature of surveys, isn't it, that we identify some ways of improving over what went well. So these are the sorts of things that were reported. You know, the importance of the team, the quite large teams in many cases for level A's, effective communications. I don't know what that means, but clearly for that event, they had worked out not just on the day, but in their planning, getting up to the event, how to work together. Interesting point about deputies for planning and controlling. and the need to work out what you mean by deputy. I've worked, for example, with Level A with 2 planners, and one has done the 1 to 10,000 courses and one's done the 1 to 7,500 courses, and that's worked really well, and they've worked together and then presented a united front. It's not so easy with deputy controllers knowing what they do, because ultimately the controller is responsible for quite a lot. So there needs to be clarity as to what the deputy controller does running up to the event. On the day before, they can be invaluable, but working out what you mean by deputy is important. Mentoring potential Level A controllers, we need more. We need younger ones. One event said we had our courses ready 7 months before the event, and I was just conscious of how unstressed they must have been compared with every other Level A event, you know, getting nearer to the date. They did have an open moorland area, which means they're less likely to have trees chopped down or building work. And good liaison with landowners, police, council, etc. Contributed to the success. I asked them if there was anything to do with the rules and ISOM and ISPROM, and they've raised a number of points. One of which is how familiar the officials were with the documents, and even what Purple Pen does or Condes does. And I tend to say to key officials, please read the rules. You know, it's an evening you'll never get back again, but it will be worth just going through with a metaphorical highlighter pen and saying, oh, didn't realize that, or didn't realize that's changed. And again, read the IOF's control description booklet, just because you'll notice something that's relevant for your event. Class combinations for some courses at the middle races caused questions. We might come on to that with looking at older competitor courses. There's quite a lot about mixing elite and non-elite and how that causes problems. So for major events, you need to talk this through as to how apart you keep them, and whether you do put them on the same course at all, or whether you're just storing up problems for yourself. Start time allocation and seeding is a dark art as far as I'm concerned, and I've always relied on experts rather than trying to understand it myself. So there are some real experts about, and they do it several times a year, whereas I would be doing it once a year or once every so many years. So getting other people, you know, delegating that is important. And there was an instance where British Orienteering and IOF had a 2-minute and a 3-minute start interval for the same class, I believe. And that was overcome by simply going for 3 minutes, because that satisfies the British, if I've got it the right way around. But there was a slight, not exactly a conflict. Officials, people struggled because some key officials were appointed late, and that's nobody's fault necessarily, but it does put stress on lots of parts of the event. And even when you've got the key officials, they tend to be busy with other events. I've had several planners for Level A events who say, well, I'm busy the next week because I'm putting on a Saturday event for my club, which is fine, but it just knocks out a couple of weeks of your planning time. A number of references to something like lastminute.com and how much was up against the clock. And I just put in a word here for the people I feel are unsung heroes of British Orienteering, and they're the printers. You know, they're not key officials in any sense, but many times they have saved events or have responded at the last minute. So I just think if we can avoid having to use them, working nights and so on, that would be good. But they have saved us many times. And one person put in this rule, and it's only part of a rule, and said it was very useful to think it through. Which says competitors, etc., are responsible for their own personal safety, responsible for assessing their own abilities to complete the course. What does that mean? And I think it had prompted a really healthy discussion with the organising team, planning and organising team, as to what it meant in the context of their event. And it was actually a night event, which brings in some extra safety considerations. But I think it was just a healthy discussion to have as to what obligation there is on the event, and what you can leave to the competitor. So I just thought that was worth thinking about. Near misses, lots. So a leaseholder on part of the area objected before the event, a storm before the event, which led to overprinting. There's a red asterisk on some of these. I'll come back to that later. Mention of campuses, university campuses. I'm not sure, I'm not aware of British Champs, etc., on university campuses that haven't had last-minute building work. Despite the best efforts of the organisers and the planners, there is always some fencing put up in the week before the event. One of the ones I was involved with had diggers that suddenly appeared, and that was a problem. Permissions. Somebody's commented that permissions are such a big job for some events that you could have a dedicated person. If your main organizer or coordinator is too busy doing permissions, they're probably not doing something else. Question about the interaction with Trello events, for example, at the British and the JK, and it's not as clear as it could be as to how much it's a separate event or it's an integral part of the JK. And I think that could do with some work on it. So I'm suggesting that goes to Events and Competition Committee for some wise heads to be put together. The perennial problem of relay labels and getting the right map to the right runner. Neil Crickmore in webinar 2 is going to talk about relays. May or may not talk about that, but it was something that a relay, JK relay, I think, had to work really hard on to make sure that they had the right ones. When you get assigned to an event a year or two ahead, you ask about the map and you're told the map will be updated, and that can mean all sorts of things. And this is about falling foul of thinking the map will be completely redrawn, and you discover that the map has gone in for the 2 days they were contracted to do and has now gone home. So it's getting clarity on what is going to happen to the out-of-date map, and by when will you have the usable version. A few things people wish they'd known or remembered. Cutting circles and lines when you've got 2 map scales. This was an interesting one for me. Came up at a fairly recent level A, that the planning was done on the original version of the map. The map was then geo-referenced and magnetic north had moved. So all the circles were then in the wrong place. And I think Purple Pen has now been updated so that you can rotate it and relocate those on the where the depressions moved to, etc. One event had drawn up contingency parts of courses, I think, if too many were going to go through a triple SI. That seemed very sensible. And there is quite a lot of talk about planning for older competitors, which will therefore come up in webinar 2. On the day of events, main car park unusable, but they had a plan B. 10 to 15 centimetres of snow on the morning of the event. And in a way, they were lucky because it was a night event. So they had several hours to deal with it. A big problem, start not set up on time. And because this is level A, it causes all sorts of knock-on issues. So that's something that you really do need to try to avoid if you possibly can. Note the asterisk, come back to it. Something you don't think about until it happens to you on the morning of the event, that you're going around all the controls, you swipe finish SI box and your SIAC turns off. An event last year had a water point in the middle of the map, was intended to just, I think, just be a load of water and some cups. Had to be manned, but it turned into the first aid point and source of advice, which I suspect they hadn't thought of, and it was just, you know, worth thinking about. And then the perennial about the finals start time allocations being published for British sprints. And this comes up almost every year, but not every year. And what if you are planning this year's or next year's, what you do about it. Also good to know, start officials being helpful and using their initiative. Both of those are potential nightmares and a potential for the event to go horribly wrong. And again, it's worth knowing now, if you're thinking about your start officials for the JK or the British or whatever, knowing that using their initiative generally ends up with them making a mess of something, because the rules, for example, for late arrivals are quite complex. And this comes into having the same start for elite and non-elite competitors, particularly if it's world ranking. That can cause difficulties. Late start lanes, they need treating in different ways. Just to note that you are required to have a backup finish timing system, and a dash cam will do what you want. It records the time and it sees the people. So is a, if you like, simple solution to something that we've struggled with in the past. And we can talk about prize givings, but they are, I think, capable of being run really well, or sometimes are difficult. It's things like using the contours, making sure they're photogenic, making sure they run quickly, etc. But planning your prize givings is really important for customer satisfaction. If I was doing it again, I'd start earlier. I'd be stronger about getting maps and courses earlier, have the timeline, and have some key meetings that you decide 6 months before, a year before. I think email is too easy to just sit there waiting, hoping something will come along. And you maybe need more of a structure than some events do. And then the risk assessments. We could probably have a whole webinar on risk assessments, and please let's not. You can treat them in a number of different ways. For some events, I get them the Saturday before the event and I'm asked to sign it off. And I know when it talks about heat exhaustion and the events in December, that it's been copied and pasted from, you know, a different version, from the last version. And it satisfies the insurance requirements and it's achieved nothing for the event. some of the things that I put asterisks on earlier are what should be in a risk assessment and should be talked through at key points in the planning cycle. For example, what happens if your start isn't set up on time? How would you deal with it? And how can you avoid it? So it's not just the, if you like, the obvious things you need for the insurance side of things, or slips and trips. It's about how can you make sure the particular elements of your event can have low risk. You know, if your start's a long way from a road, that's different from it's next to a road. If it's a long way from assembly, you need radios probably to communicate, etc. So how you treat the risk assessment is really important. I wanted to learn from complaints and protests, but we don't have a way of capturing them very successfully. But these are the ones I'm aware of at level A. And 1.5 of them were about getting to the start on time, which led to a complaint and then led to a protest. From memory, and I might be wrong, I think the complaint and the protest were turned down because the rules say you've got to get to the start on time for level A, unless it's the organiser's fault, and it wasn't. And the verbal complaint clearly isn't a complaint because it hasn't been written down. And then one about controls on similar features being close to each other, which led to a complaint and then a protest. So webinar 3 has got some scenarios where you are on the jury or you're the organiser. Please, can you just talk through how that's going to work? Right. Any chat and questions, Joe?
Hello, hello. There has been some chat going on, and it's been some good commentary on the role of assistant controller is the title they've used. And Trevor mentioned it as it was at the Scottish 6 Days. Emma said that she was an assistant controller at the JK Middle last year.
Great.
And said it described the role that she had well. Richard had a comment regarding seeding for BNOC 2022. Adrian Moya.
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. Fabian 4 was invaluable at solving the seeding issues.
Yeah.
And Emma just commented on the complaint situation that they had at JK Middle, and we turned it down as it was competitor fault, like you said. I'm just checking the Q&A now. John asked a few minutes ago, can you elaborate on finish box turning off SIAC so can't check other controls? Do you mean for controllers?
Yeah.
Perfect. And does anybody else have any extra questions? Pop them in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand, use the Q&A. All forms are welcome. Give everybody a quick minute to do so.
No, onwards.
We could go onwards, and I can always sneak some questions in at the end.
Thank you. Okay, looking ahead then, next week is planning for older competitors, and then Neil is going to talk partly at least about relays, and Simon, I'm not quite sure what he's doing, but it's about running better level A events. Webinar 3, Ronan and Julie will talk about having world ranking status on top of your event, and I'm going to give you some jury scenarios. Here, the asterisk doesn't mean put it in your risk assessment. It means you will get the stuff on the Wednesday before the event, before the webinar. So you do the pre-reading, and then you're ready for the group discussions about planning and about being on the jury. Right, next week then says, and you can take on whatever role you like, whether it's planning or controlling, it doesn't matter. But you are planning or controlling a level A event, which is middle or long. So it's what we call forest, even if it's not forest, it's not urban anyway. And you're uncertain about about requirements for older competitors and define older however you like. But I'm going to send out, I can't remember how many there are, but let's say 6 or 7 courses from the last 3 years' major events. So one of them looks like this. And this is the M85, M90, W80 course at Braunton Burrows in 2021. And you can look at the course and you can maybe look for any legs that you as planner or controller would say, oh, that's awful. But you won't really know whether it was a great course or otherwise without looking at the times. So there's a graph, and the graph shows the winning times of the 13 people who are on this course. So you have to be a bit careful because 13 isn't a big number to draw conclusions about. But when you've looked at a number of these courses, maybe you can, and you'll see that 2 people were quite well ahead of the estimated or expected winning time. So there was say a 42 and a 43 minute times for first person, second person, and all the way up to 130 something minutes for number 13. So if you look at that, you know, on the one hand, it's saying the course should have been longer, and maybe on the other hand, it said the course shouldn't be longer. But was there anything about the planning that would inform you for future events? So you might look at the length of the course, the leg length of each leg, technical difficulty, physical difficulty, and what else do you think you ought to be thinking about when you're planning for older competitors? So if you look at that when you get your homework on Wednesday, and then on the 12th, put you into breakout groups and see what you can come up with. Does that make sense? Yep. Right, that will do me.
In that case, anything extra from you, Alan? Sorry.
Can I just encourage people to register for webinar 2 and 3 if you want to take part before the Wednesdays, and it will just make getting the information out a bit easier for Joe and team.
Yep, that's a great point. I've just put a link to the page where you can find all the details of all the sessions. In that case, I'll draw things to a close a bit, and we're just in time. I was a little bit of a worrywart earlier because I thought we were finishing at past, and then realised that I just wasn't right on there. So that's why I may have sounded like I was rushing you. So apologies for that, everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and a huge thank you to David, Alan, and Barry for the presentations. Absolutely brilliantly informative, and all the parts that weren't miles over my head, I really enjoyed. I enjoyed the other parts too as well. In which case, so thank you all for attending. I'll be following up with an email tomorrow that will include the link to this, the YouTube video for this session. Feel free to share that link with anybody, and also if you'd like to keep an eye on all things British Orienteering webinars, then you'll be able to click subscribe, and you should get a little notification by email when that comes up. I'll also include a link to a feedback form, which will just be short as a good opportunity for you to ask any extra questions that you have post-session when you've slept on it, perhaps. I'm going to quickly pop in the chat the email addresses for Alan, myself, and Howard. Alan will be the main point of contact for questions on all the sections, but we'll be able to collate those and get those passed around as well. It's really great to see such a fantastic number of people here this evening. It's been really enjoyable, and nice to see faces as well, I do have to say. So maybe we'll have to make sure that the webcams are a standard as well. But from myself and from everybody else, thank you very much for coming this evening, and hope to see you again soon.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, everybody.